Today on the Founder Shop Talk, we're sitting down with Ivan Rahman, the founder of Avistar, a cybersecurity startup tackling one of the most overlooked and fastest growing attack services in enterprise tech, unhuman identity. Ivan spent nearly a decade at Northwestern Mutual running back-end systems responsible for 65 billion and 300 million transactions a day. And what he saw in those annual compliance audits is what sent him on this mission. So let's get into it. Welcome, Ivan, to the show. And before we get into Avistar, just tell us who you are, where you started, where you grew up, and we would love to hear like the dinner party version, not necessarily the pitch slides version.
Fair enough. Abdalla, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here with you. So the dinner party version of my story is, I tell people I'm a kid born in New York City. My parents came to the United States in the 1980s. And so a lot of my background comes from just growing up in New York City as a immigrant kid being raised in Queens before the gentrification. And that's a key point because, a lot of my grind and hustle and grit that I am proud of today, and it may sound cliche, really stems from my upbringing in the city as a 1990s and 90s kid in New York City. In terms of my background overall, we ended up moving to Los Angeles at one point, so in the mid-1990s. And then I went to elementary school, middle school, high school there, and then actually went to University of California in San Diego and made my way to the Midwest through AmeriCorps. So I actually volunteered through the AmeriCorps program and was assigned to the Milwaukee and worked with a number of nonprofits in the Milwaukee area before going into corporate and then eventually as a founder. In terms of my corporate career, I was last the assistant director of financial operations at Northwestern Mutual. So we were directly responsible for the ERP and general ledger systems. So my team was directly responsible for like every dollar in, every dollar out for, Fortune 100 organization. What that meant was I had a chance to work with critical systems. I had a chance to really understand the nitty gritty of what it takes to make an organization that has over 700 billion, 500 billion in AUM, depends on which year you're looking at, but still in hundreds of billions of dollars, and just being able to understand like what it takes to make sure the modern enterprise is operational and meeting SLAs of 99.999%, so that we basically had near 100% uptime. And so working with critical systems, I learned about infrastructure and a lot of the cloud infrastructure we were using, and the fragility behind a lot of the identities that we, assigned to a number of automated tasks and jobs in that system. So these service accounts that we set up, we had over 700 or so systems behind the scenes, making sure that we could do our work day to day. And a lot of those credentials, I noticed were over-permissioned or maybe not well configured. And so that was something that I took on myself as our team to kind of make sure that we were doing things correctly. And then really understanding the audit process of ensuring access, that was another aspect of what we were focused on. So all in all, that all informed my desire to become a founder after I left in 2024. And then I made the decision in April 2025 to start Avistar.ai. So Avistar.ai is focused on scanning cloud environments, identifying all of the over-permissioned accounts that you have in your cloud infrastructure. That includes service accounts, and now with AI agents coming into play, understanding what the roles and permissions are for those agents so that you don't have over-permissioned accounts, which may result in potentially improper access by a bad actor.
Awesome. Thank you. Like, I love your story. If I can maybe take you back a little bit to going from front end engineering to basically leading a 25 engineer and managing like 65 billion in transaction. Like, how does that arc happen? Basically, what taught you doing and working on scale like that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Abdalla. So in the 8 years that I was at Northwestern Mutual, I was there from 2016 to 2024. I started off in the digital marketing department. And so I was directly responsible for about 7,500 financial advisor websites. So basically all of the web presence that their financial advisory practice had online, that was kind of our team. And so through that role, I learned a great deal about just systemized processes and how to kind of propagate content and other things at scale. And then I joined their digital innovation team in 2017. So about 18 months in marketing, and then I joined in July 2017 their digital innovation team. While there, I was started off as a research analyst. So It was a really interesting role where I was able to, explore AI, quantum, bioinformatics very early on before a lot of this became kind of just the terms that we use today and take for granted. I remember we led a number of projects around using machine learning for fraud detection. And so we were very early on in learning and exploring how to look for fraud within financial systems, using training data. And so that was something that we were looking at, back in 2017. And so that role exposed me to the wide berth of like all the possibilities that were out there. And so then I took that experimental approach and became a product leader, ended up having a actual product management role on the innovation team, eventually ended up actually leading the product design team. And so we had about 4 or 5 product designers on our team. And so really had the chance to be able to explore the back end systems, the front end systems,
Mm.
UX, understanding product development, really understanding lean, product development strategies. And then when I was approached about the financial operations role, it was around modernization. So how do we go from antiquated batch processes running on mainframe to API driven, solutions that are connected to cloud infrastructure. So that's really where I stepped into that role. And so we were able to develop a number of APIs for Northwestern Mutual to be able to handle cash disbursements, general ledger transactions, all sorts of data inflows and outflows to downstream applications. So that kind of role just gave me the ability to like flex some of the muscles I had gained in innovation to
Mm.
build out new capabilities and modernize some of the more legacy systems that were there.
Mm.
And so all in all, just having the back end, front end, user design, user experience concepts, those helped me quite a lot now as a founder.
Yeah. And like any founder story like I've met in the past, like there's always a moment where frustration becomes like, I'm going to build something about this. When did that flip for you? And do you remember that moment?
I 100% remember the moment. I was actually sitting in a meeting with about, I don't know, about 100 other people on a Zoom call, and we were doing an introduction for our annual SOC audit. And as we were going through the audit process, I remember looking for a lot of the documentation for some of the legacy infrastructure that we had. And I remember asking a predecessor, where's the documentation for XYZ system? I can't name names, but they were like, go to the filing cabinet on the back wall of the north building of like, floor 7. And I remember going to this filing cabinet and pulling out this giant
Yeah.
binder that was compiled in the 1980s and 90s and going,
Mm.
this is the documentation, right? And going like, oh my God, like how are we supposed to modernize when half of the documentation is not even digitized?
Yeah.
And going through that, I had a number of feelings where I started using certain tools and going, without naming names and putting up myself for potential libel, I don't want to speak badly of some of the players that are out there,
Yeah.
but using some of the, legacy and incumbent tools that I've seen firsthand is just basically, Excel spreadsheets plus. And I think to myself about how manual, how tedious, how burdensome going through this kind of process is. And it really frustrated me. And so I wanted to create something that was developer focused, developer friendly, made it a lot easier to ingest information connected via JSON or API so that we can have data connected to different dashboards. And so you wouldn't be beholden to just those legacy systems that kind of forced you into their ecosystem, made it very hard to work with. And so the other aspect of all this is, in that role, I was able to see the cost of a lot of these applications. And that really blew my mind as well. A lot of the pricing around these tools are geared towards just that upper echelon of companies. They're all priced for the Fortune 100. And so it just makes it very unapproachable for the mid-sized enterprise. They
Yeah.
can't seem to, I've heard of companies literally offering loans for licensing. People are actually having to take loans to buy licensing for some of the software that they need. And I thought that that was ridiculous. Like the solution itself should be priced to enable all companies to have access to security. And so how do we democratize that access as well?
Yeah. Absolutely, and it does make total sense, and it's a good segue to your product and maybe talking about the solution Avistar. And before we get into that, maybe for people watching who are in security, can you explain what a non-human identity is and why it's becoming such a massive problem right now, especially with financial transactions?
Yeah. So I'm not going to feign and say that I'm the premier cybersecurity expert out there. That's not at all what I'm coming on this platform to say, or even as a founder. My team, I look to them as the experts, and that we've assembled an incredible array of individuals who have expertise across many areas. So when I was in my role, non-human identity is, I understand it, is various surface accounts, APIs, or other types of, like it's in the name, non-human entity that's created in order to do some sort of task. Now, typically, what we had are deterministic entities like service accounts that had, certain specified jobs on a day-to-day basis. They would take data from a certain endpoint, move them into the cloud, into some sort of S3 bucket, made that data available for some sort of downstream API to connect to. We also include things like API keys and tokens within that name, but there's debate as to what a non-human identity is. However, today I've heard a lot of conversation around AI agents. And so at the highest level, an AI agent is a type of non-human identity. However, there are distinctions. So AI agents in particular have deterministic workflows, but they also could have non-deterministic workflows depending on their task. And so you may have agents that, they take our meeting notes, for example, and they transcribe it. That is a simple task that we all have probably used in all of our meetings so far. However, there are also non-deterministic ones. For example, the challenges with OpenClaw, where you have an agent running 24/7 on a machine that has admin privileges to your root access to your folder or to your computer, and then has the ability to go make a call on your behalf. Or, I heard
Mm,
a story recently where somebody on a podcast was saying they had a OpenClaw instance. They told it to go make a reservation. It tried to connect to the OpenTable API, couldn't do that. So it decided to go download a skill instead. And it had the voice skill and then called the restaurant to make the reservation directly. So it figured out on its own how to go about making that reservation without
mm,
the direct instruction from the user. This is a non-deterministic behavior. And we are now approaching a situation where, as we're granting access to all of these agents, it's becoming the hot topic because everybody wants to figure out, how do you prevent the agent from doing something it's not supposed to? The risk really is there are things like prompt injection, SQL injection, and other forms of vectors, if you will, where a person could use the agent to extract data, to do some sort of malicious behavior, deleting a database.
yeah,
We hear all the time of a AI agent being told to clear some space and it deletes the entire code base. And so
yeah.
that is a behavior pattern that we need to figure out and understand the permissions and guardrails around.
Got it. And just to understand the product a little bit more, like, for the audience as well, like, if you can walk me through Avistar and what it actually does today, and if I'm a security team and I want to plug it into my system, like, what usually happen and what would I get out of
Yeah, so we are definitely, so Avistar.ai is built with the idea that we are cloud agnostic. So at many organizations, you have different cloud environments. You may have AWS as your primary, or Azure as your primary, and AWS as backup. So many organizations have multi-cloud environments. So we're built for multi-cloud environment teams where you have more than just one cloud infrastructure. We plug in directly into the cloud as a read-only account. We built out a small language model that's highly tuned and very specific to just access management and credentials. We analyze all of the identities associated with the system so we can actually identify human identities as well as non-human ones. We discern and focus mostly on the machine identities. And so we look at the permission layer. Do they have admin rights? Do they have wildcard access? Do they have any sort of potential configuration that could be putting the company at risk? And so that's really what we're focused on and trying to reduce that footprint as much as possible. We also have downstream recommended remediation. So we don't do automated remediation because of the potential impact to downstream systems. So we can provide guidance on how to remediate. And so we actually provide generated remediation, and we've made sure that the observability and tracing around that is on point so that you're not going to get different answers every time you try to get a different configuration. So we're making sure that it's highly trained and focus on that specific use case. And because they're in isolation for each client, there's no potential risk of having the same data leak across different cloud environments for the different clients. And so we try to make sure that we're doing things as secure as possible and make sure that the tool itself is as useful as it can be and adding value to the customer. At the end of the day, we're taking a process that typically took about 11 hours. We've calculated how long it took the traditional route and condensed that down to about 15 minutes. And so we're really reducing the amount of manual effort required to reduce the permissions around non-human identities.
Got it. And I really like from as far as I know, like one of the pilots that you had, you prevented 11 escalation path from hitting production, and I think that's a really good case study to kind of unpack a little bit, because that's potentially 77 to 80 million in exposure or breach exposure. What was that moment like when the client said your scan was right and you validated and proved your market value?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So we work with a Fortune 500 healthcare organization. I won't name names. However, what we did is we were connected into their AWS infrastructure. We found about 440 identities. 300 of them were over permission, not critically so, but we did find about 11 critical escalation paths that they were able to address, and they were able to make sure that wasn't available in any sort of production environment. Now, the number that you mentioned is derived from the cost of breach report from IBM. And so we applied the $7.4 million per breach cost, according to IBM, to the 11 escalation paths. And that's where we got the number for 70 to about $80 million in terms of potential, impact that we had. Now, when we actually were plugged in, they ran our scanner once and we thought, okay, so they're kind of bored with it. We jumped on a call with them. We wanted to understand, what they saw, and they were like, "We're seeing a lot of these identified as potential risky, risks in our system, and we're wondering, is your model hallucinating?" Right? And so they thought at first that maybe we were providing some made up number. And we were like, no, like we're seeing this also on our end. Like, please verify. Like, we would love for you to verify and make sure, like, if we are hallucinating, that you call us out on that. They went through and they manually verified and they were like, oh my God, like it's actually true. And so immediately they plugged us into their QA environment so that anytime new code was propagated, it was getting scanned. They ended up running our scanner like 30 plus times in that quarterly engagement. And so we went from just being used once to being part of their day-to-day development practice. And what we found is that in being able to kind of be part of that, we saw that number rise to like 500 plus. And so even in that few months that we were on, we saw the number of applications and new software that was being written. The non-human identity number will continue to grow. It's not getting smaller, right? As new ideas and new applications are being launched every day, and you have now vibe coding as a capability for many teams, I only see that number increasing over time. And so I don't see that number ever decreasing. And as a result, like, I think this is really where the value prop is for companies to be able to leverage Avistar. We can come in, we can help you initially find the baseline as to where you're at today. But moving forward, as your teams continue to deploy new code and new applications, we can help you identify and make sure that you don't have shadow AI running in the background as well.
Yeah. And I think that's great. And I'm mentioning this case study as well because I believe after that you pivoted towards MSPs. I would love to learn a little bit more about that, like the pivoting moment with any founder or startup. It always happen, and it's good to be flexible. But for people who don't know what's an MSP and why is that a smarter go-to market for Avistar right now, and how you're pivoting, would you mind just sharing more about that?
100%. So this is actually something that's really interesting, and many investors ask me, like, why go to MSPs and not direct? And so my answer to the question is a little nuanced. So first of all, our pilot gave us validation in the form of validating the technology itself. We were able to make sure that the technology worked. We were able to find areas of concern, and we were able to flag that. However, one of the biggest findings was when they asked us, are you guys going to help us remediate it also? And so the question was directed and pointed because it made us realize that, are we going to become a service company or are we a product company? And we wanted to stay a product company. And to do that, we needed to be able to like actually go and do the work. And so MSPs became a really nice dovetail with our solution because now we can actually start providing the discovery layer. So for many MSPs, the discovery stage is actually the most cost prohibitive They have to have an engineer go on site, go do the work, pull the information manually, gather all the documentation, and then they can start doing work on where the baseline is. We can help in that process by taking that one chunk that is around cloud environment discovery and shrink it down into minutes. And so that's the number one benefit that we can provide MSPs. The other side of that is because we have the remediation capability now built in, it also augments their ability to like do more custom work. So instead of having, maybe a 5-year contract that was cost prohibitive, they can actually offer to their clients the ability to do remediation work and do attack all of the over permission accounts instead of just a couple or a handful. And so for many years, something that I heard from many practitioners is that they would simply accept the low impact or low risk CVEs that they had impacting their organization. They would accept some of the over permission accounts because it wasn't as risky as some of the network based exploits that were out there. And so this actually kind of allows the company to say, no, we're actually going to hit all of our exploits. We're not just going to focus on the external facing network based ones, but now we have a tool that can help reduce that low impact exposure as well. And the reason it's so critical is now in the Mythos age, you have the potential for AI to basically be used for cybersecurity threats where they're able to stitch together, 4 or 5 different exploits in a way to be able to get access to critical information. So with the MSPs, we found a really nice partnership. We found the ability to work with them directly and give them the ability to be more proactive versus reactive to their customers. So now they can actually be a value add resource versus simply another cost center for their clients. And so that's what we're really excited about. We believe that that partnership model is going to be key. And at the end of the day, as we move forward into the future, I believe that MSPs are going to be in many ways the critical juncture point for any AI solution to be implemented within an organization. Many organizations don't have fully fledged development teams. So they rely heavily on their MSP relationship to enable AI within their organization in the first place. And so it becomes a really nice kind of pairing where we can help make sure that when they implement AI for their clients, it's done so in a secure way.
Absolutely. And if you don't mind me bragging a little bit for you, you already signed 2 agreement as well for MSP partnerships, which I think it's really great. And it speak of the value that you're bringing already to have partners with that. I think also you mentioned that you wouldn't be, or you want to be like Stripe for MSPs. Would love to hear a little bit more about that. An embedded revenue enabler, just a security tool. Can we unpack this idea a little bit more?
Yeah, Abdalla, thank you so much for bringing that up. So in many ways, I look at Stripe as kind of the model of the ultimate enabler, right? In many ways, it's not just Stripe, but there are many others. But tools like them have made it so that it's possible for companies to create a new revenue stream. They can now start to make money on, potential work that they're doing anyways. And so with MSPs, what I want to be is basically a plug and play solution for them. So we actually have a one-click install feature for those on AWS. So we can actually get implemented very quickly into an AWS environment. They can deploy us very rapidly within 4 to 5 minutes. And then within the next 10 to 15 minutes, our scanner will run and generate a report. And so it moves very quickly through the system, aggregates the information, and puts together a report. They can then export that as a PDF report to share with non-developer customers. So they can actually share kind of like compliance-focused frameworks and say, hey, here's where these over-permission accounts don't map directly or they map directly to NIST or ISO or SOC frameworks. So it just becomes kind of a very easy point-and-click solution where they can deploy us, have results right away, and then they can use the reports itself for billable hours. So we have API integrations that we're building to kind of get connected into ticketing systems like Kaseya, ConnectWise, and Halo. And so we're looking for ways to be just integrated into the ticketing system. So as soon as we find some issues, they can deploy a ticket, and now they have billable hours that they can charge against. And so that gives them the ability to generate revenue as well. And so we want to be a revenue generator. We don't want to be a cost center.
And that totally makes sense. And it is exciting, but I would love to learn a little bit more about your background as a specifically founder. You have raised like around 400K, building out of Wisconsin, outside of the big tech hubs. This is also the places that we always look and we support, as you probably already know. But I would love love to know a little bit more about your journey. How has it been like building outside the big tech hubs? How is the scene of the tech startup scene in Wisconsin and other places outside of the tech hub?
No, I really appreciate that. So I jokingly say that my hunting grounds is Madison, Milwaukee, and Chicago. They're all within like a 200, 300 mile, radius of one another. And so, I really try to focus in on this region. When I moved to Wisconsin in 2008, 2009, it was the height of the recession. And what I saw was all across the country, there was uncertainty all around. But what I found that I really leaned in on in the Milwaukee ecosystem, especially, was the sense of community. It was a very strong community that developed in that time period around 2009. An individual named Steve Glynn, who I see as a very close friend and mentor, initiated a group called Sprinkler, and he brought together, the young upstarts and misfits that wanted to do something different and just had a place for them to kind of come together and share their ideas. And this salon experience where people could just share and propagate new ideas like just became a way for us to like really build an ecosystem. And many of the people who joined that organization back then went on to become industry leaders today. And so a lot of the individuals that I was able to build relationships with came out of that group and that community. And so the community focus is really what I find the most important aspect of the Midwest in terms of culture. And even today, so many of my initial warm introductions to MSPs or to individuals has come from that community.
Yeah.
I was just in an event this Saturday, and it was on a Saturday, so it's not on a weekday.
Mhm.
400 plus cybersecurity practitioners came together in Chicago, and we're exploring all sorts of ideas around AI, vibe hacking, all the way
Yeah.
to how to secure yourself in today's world. And so I was just blown away by the engagement that the people have. And that's really what I found so motivating in the Midwest. And I do believe it's the secret sauce of what makes the Midwest special. We may not be as large of an ecosystem as Silicon Valley or New York, but we do make up for it in the amount of community and engagement that we have here. And so today, especially in a remote world where we can have virtual calls like this, there's no
Yeah.
reason we can't play across the entire continent, but still have at home here in the Midwest.
Absolutely. And there are always like great ideas and great founders coming out of middle America as well, like yourself, and reaching, and the virtual community is getting bigger and bigger. What's the hardest thing about being a founder, in your opinion, that you didn't expect when you started this journey?
Yeah. So the term that I've heard from people, as a manager, I always had this notion of it's us versus them, in terms of the individual contributor trying to, work and not really understand the insights or the decision making for the C-level leadership. I think what I've learned is to respect and understand where a lot of the stressors for C-level leadership comes from and understand the dynamics around, not just the board, but potential investors and stakeholders and shareholders. And there's so many different voices that, pull at the founding team or the leadership team, that it's something that really struck a chord, and it's something that I've kind of learned to adjust to. And I think one of the things that as a founder, my recommendation is to any new founder is like, know your audience, know who you're talking to, know if you're going to approach investors, understand what are the driving forces for them. If you're going to speak to your customer, understand what are their pain points, what drives them to do their work day to day. If you're going to speak to, potential users of your tool, understand like what are their pain points. And so having an empathy first approach is extremely important. And I think for founders, you need to have that muscle. And I think that one of the things that I would say is also understand who your audience is, understand what their needs are. So that requires empathy, listening, and basically patience to be able to understand what are the dynamics and the driving forces behind the scenes that maybe aren't shared up.
Agreed. I couldn't have said it better myself. So 5 years from now, as a founder, where does Avistar look like, and what does winning mean to you, or your goal in 5 years?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll start with the latter first, and I'll say that an ideal future in my mind is one where we have the ability to leverage AI tools. I know there's a lot of contention these days behind overuse of AI, data centers, the negative impact to jobs. I think that it's one of those technologies that has changed so much so quickly that people are they're afraid of like what the outcomes might be. But it's such a powerful tool that there's no putting the cat back in the bag. And with that being said, I do believe that in many ways we need to understand how to safeguard it, how to make sure that it's not, harming us as individuals. One thing that I am most frustrated by is just the day-to-day news that I hear. Just recently, Stryker had a major breach. Another one was the recent one, Canvas for schools. 275 million people have their information stolen, including children that use Canvas products for their elementary schools. And so you have quite literally private information being leaked everywhere. I don't want a future where AI is just another means of kind of exploiting individuals. Heard a quote and it's like, I want to keep humans as the main character. Right. I do want to see a world where humans continue to be the main character, but we can use AI to make our lives better and more meaningful and more effective. And the only way we do that is having the proper guardrails around it so that it's not being used to harm us as individuals. Now, there are many, many threats in the world. The world continues to be uncertain. And so what I tell people is like, I want to use AI productively to better the lives of everybody around me and to make sure that we are benefiting as a society as a whole, not just, a handful of few. And so that's really a vision for what I would love to see in the future. And that's what I want to build towards. Some people may agree and some people may disagree. That's okay. But I do believe that AI is going to continue playing a role in our lives, and we need to make sure that it's safe to do so.
I think that's an amazing goal and a good message that we probably all can rally behind. So before we wrap up, where can people find Avistar and find you, and who should be reaching out to you right now?
Yeah, so our website is Avistar.ai. We're like so many other AI startups using the .ai extension.
Yep.
I think it's probably a little overused by this point. However, you can find me on LinkedIn. I am a avid contributor on LinkedIn. I try to maintain a community there. So please reach out directly on LinkedIn and connect with me wherever you want. I'm not a big user of X. I'm not a big user of other social media platforms. But if you really
Same.
need to say hello, you can also email me at hello@avistar.ai.
That's great. And thank you so much, Evan, again, for joining me today. It has been a pleasure and the discussion's been great. Thank you so much
Thank you so much for
giving us
having
all
me,
your time.
Abdalla. I appreciate the opportunity, and I'm so excited to see what's next around the corner. Eager to continue building and making, hopefully building the future that we all want to share.
That's great. And thank you, everyone who's watching, and we'll see you in the next time.